So now that we've talked about the difference between producers and consumers, we're going to talk about the different types of consumers. So the first way that we're going to talk about consumers is based on what they eat. Now, again, these terms should be familiar because you guys should have gone over most of them in middle school. So an organism that eats only plants is an herbivore. All right. Some examples of herbivores are zebras, elephants, deer. Okay. Now they don't need to just eat plants, but they eat only plant products. So things like berries, twigs, bark, that's all part of a plant. So if they don't eat any other animals, then they are considered herbivores. All right. A lot of insects are herbivores because they just eat grass and other leaves. We also have, like I said, four-legged animals like deer and giraffes. Okay, those are herbivores as well. Okay. Now, an omnivore eats, oh, sorry, carnivore eats only meat. All right, so carne means meat. So a carnivore eats only meat. So these are things at the top of the food chain, right? So lions, they eat, zebras. You don't see lions going around munching plants, right? So a lion is an example of a carnivore. Maybe a hawk, okay? So a hawk will eat mice and snakes, but it doesn't really eat plants, so it would be considered a carnivore. So carnivores don't eat plants, they only eat meat, which comes from other animals. So other living things that are animals. So insects, maybe they eat small rodents, maybe they eat larger animals. So a carnivore consumes only meat. Snakes are carnivores, they typically don't eat a lot of plant material. Now, omnivores consume both meat and plants. So most humans are omnivores. The exception here is if you're a vegetarian, then you would be an herbivore because you don't eat any meat products. Okay. So other animals that are omnivores, maybe a frog eats some crickets, but it also eats grass. Maybe bears eat fish, but they also eat berries and plants. Those would be examples of omnivores. So if you know these and you're like, I really don't want to write these down, that's fine. If you already know them and you can tell me the difference, then that's fine. You don't need to write them down. But for those of you who are like, I probably won't remember these, you should write them down. Okay. Now, the last one, you probably have not heard of this word before. Detritivore. You guys know them as decomposers, okay? But the grown-up high school word for decomposer is detritivore, right? So vor means to eat, and it eats detritus. Detritus is dead or decaying matter. Now, the key here is that these types of organisms break down dead plant and animal matter to return the nutrients to the ecosystem. Some good examples of this. We get earthworms, okay? Dung beetles, they break down dung or basically animal poop. Um, Fungi, okay, so like mushrooms, they break down dead plant matter and animal matter, and they break it down, and what they do is they actually they turn it into soil, okay? So earthworms do this, like I said, fungi. Now this is different from a scavenger. A scavenger is something that eats dead stuff. So you guys might remember like vultures, or maybe hyenas, they eat stuff that's already dead. They're not breaking it down and returning it to the soil necessarily. They're just eating dead stuff. Okay. So eating dead stuff is different from breaking down dead stuff and returning the nutrients to the ecosystem. All right. So like I said, fungi, we have some kinds of millipedes and beetles that do this. and then earthworms. And these are good examples of detritivores. Okay, so again, fancy word for decomposer, and you should have already seen most of these terms. Okay, now the second way we can classify consumers. So here we're talking about how they eat, right? We can also classify them based on what they eat, okay, what level they're at in the food chain, okay? So here we're talking about, all right, what do they eat, right? Now we're going to talk about where are they in the food chain, and we can classify them as different types of consumers based on where they are in the food chain. So how does this work? You guys have probably seen a food chain before, right? So here's a food chain. We have a plant, it's a producer, right? Because it makes its own food. The caterpillar eats the plant, okay? So the caterpillar is what we're gonna call the primary consumer. Primary means number one, okay? So a primary consumer eats producers or eats plants. So this is typically the second thing on our food web. So we say the first thing is the producer. The second thing, or whatever eats the producer or the plants, is called the primary consumer. Okay. Now, again, our consumers can have more than one label. We're just labeling these things, these organisms, so we have a better grasp on what they do in the ecosystem. So this guy, right, if he's a primary consumer and he eats only leaves, what would he be considered from our previous slide? Would he be an herbivore, an omnivore, or a carnivore, or a detritivore? He would be a herbivore, okay? So again, these guys can have different labels. We're just classifying them so that we can learn more about how they work in the ecosystem, okay? Now, the guy that eats the caterpillar. So here we have this bird. He's going to eat the caterpillar. The bird is the secondary consumer. Okay, so secondary means two, right? So he's going to eat the primary consumer. So the secondary consumer eats primary consumers, right? So it just goes along in this food chain, right? Starts with the producer, then we get the primary consumer, and then the secondary consumer. Now let's think about birds for a minute. Do we think a bird is an herbivore, an omnivore, or a detritivore? Think about what birds eat. Well, he's eating this caterpillar, right? So that's another animal. So he's either an omnivore or a carnivore, right? But birds also eat berries and twigs, right? So they eat plants and animals. So this guy would be an omnivore, okay? Now we have this really big, mean-looking bird over here. He's what we call a tertiary consumer, okay? So tertiary stands for third level consumer, right? And so if he's only eating the bird, let's pretend he only eats the bird, right? He would be a carnivore, okay? So a tertiary consumer or a third level consumer eats the secondary one. So we go producer, primary, secondary, and tertiary. Okay, so again, we can label these guys by what they eat, or we can label them by what position they are in the food chain. Okay, so you guys think you can do this? We're going to see if you can do this now. We're going to do a little practice. You'll do one with me, and then you'll do a practice worksheet. Okay, so the first thing I want us to do, I want us to look at this food web. Okay, so what's the difference between a food web and a food chain? Well, a food web has lots of different connections, right? A food chain is just a single line, just like this, right? So we see it's just a line, just like a chain. A chain is just a line, right? Whereas a web, a spider web, is a lot bigger. So we're going to first list all the food chains, okay? So list all food chains. So let's find the first one. We're going to start with the wildflowers, right? So the wildflowers, okay? Now we got to pick an organism, right? So the rabbit will go next. And then we'll do the hawk. So this will be our first food chain, these guys following the arrows. So we just write down one pathway. So notice these arrows are showing one pathway. So I'm going to write this one down, okay? So I'm going to write flowers, okay, and then rabbit, and then hawk. So that's one food chain in this food web, right? So now we need to find another food chain. So is there another one that also starts with wildflowers? What's the other path, another path we could take? Well, another path we could take is we could say rabbit, right? Snake, and then hawk, right? Another pathway. So I'm going to write that one down. So flowers, rabbit, snake, and hawk, right? What else? Let's pick another color. We'll do another one here. So wildflowers, we could go to mouse and then hawk. Okay. So flowers, mouse, and then hawk. Okay. And then we could also do flowers, mouse, snake, hawk, right? So let's do that one. Flowers, mouse, snake, hawk. Okay, so we're gonna start with those. I know we didn't do the grass ones, but we're just gonna start with these right now because I just want to show you how this is gonna work. Okay, so the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna label the producers on our food chains, right? So producers make their own food. So which ones are producers on here? The flowers, right? So I'm gonna label these with a P for producer, okay? Now, we got to find the primary consumers, the things that eat the producers, right? So in this example, the primary consumer, which I'm just going to label with a 1, or you could do PC for primary consumer, is the rabbit, okay? Over here, it's the mouse, okay? Now, the secondary consumer, right? The hawk is the secondary consumer here because it's eating the rabbit, right? So we're just going to go ahead and label these, okay, until we get all the way to the end. So primary consumer, secondary, and tertiary, okay? Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to identify whether or not these animals are herbivores, omnivores, or detritivores, okay? So remember, we don't label the producers, right? Because they're not consumers. We're only labeling the consumers. So bunny rabbit here. Our bunny, what does our bunny eat? It eats wildflowers and grass. So our rabbit is going to be what? An herbivore, an omnivore, or a carnivore? Our bunny is going to be an herbivore, right? So I would label my bunny with an H for herbivore. What about my hawk? What does the hawk eat? The hawk eats the rabbit, the mouse, and the snake, right? So he's going to be a carnivore because he only eats meat. And what about the snake? Snake eats the rabbit and the mouse, so he's going to be a carnivore. And then the mouse, what does the mouse eat? Wildflowers and grass. So the mouse is a herbivore, okay? So we would just label those. So this is how we label consumers, okay? So you guys are gonna try this now. You're gonna list all the food chains and then you're gonna label them based on primary consumer, secondary, and tertiary. And remember, we always start with producers, okay? All right, have a great day and good luck with the worksheet.